Under the warm sun of Jerusalem, a young Solomon stood, carrying the weight of a crown he never imagined would rest on his head. His father, David, the warrior king, had left him not only a throne, but also a legacy to guard and a God to serve. Solomon was not a warrior like his father. His hands were not scarred from battle, but his heart longed for wisdom. In a dream at Gibeon, he bowed low before God, whispering not for riches or power, but for understanding to guide a nation. The request pleased heaven, and God answered with more than Solomon had asked. Wisdom beyond the minds of men was poured into him, a gift so rare that his name would soon echo across continents. The stories began spreading quickly, how Solomon could unravel riddles and solve disputes with brilliance. From the case of two women fighting over a child to decisions that stunned his court, his wisdom became his crown jewel. But wisdom was not the only thing God granted him. Wealth and honor were added, making Solomon a beacon of unmatched greatness among the kings of the earth. Before we embark on this captivating journey, we would love your support. Hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our latest stories. For 7 years, stone by stone, cedar by cedar, the vision took form. Workers from Israel and allies beyond the sea toiled under the blazing sun to raise pillars that seemed to touch the heavens. The temple was more than architecture. It was a heartbeat for a people who had once wandered without a home. At its dedication, fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifices and filling the courts with the presence of God. Israel stood in awe, their faces lit by both the flame and the hope that they were now truly a chosen people. Solomon, clothed in royal robes, lifted his hands and prayed a prayer that would bind generations to God's covenant. Nations heard of this wonder, and whispers of Solomon's glory traveled far beyond Israel's borders. His court became a magnet for rulers, merchants, and seekers of wisdom who longed to see the man blessed beyond measure. Gold, silver, and treasures flowed into his city until Jerusalem sparkled like a jewel among nations. Songs were written of his majesty, and every street hummed with prosperity under his reign. Yet with fame came attention, not only from kings and traders, but from daughters of distant lands. Marriages became treaties, and treaties became doors for foreign princesses to enter Solomon's palace. At first, each union seemed practical, a safeguard of peace and an assurance of prosperity. But soon, the palace that once echoed with prayers began to fill with voices from every culture under the sun. Solomon's charm, sharpened by wisdom, made him irresistible to the women who sought him. His eyes carried both knowledge and mystery, drawing affection from queens, princesses, and maidens alike. Inside the palace, silken chambers grew crowded with rivals cloaked in beauty and ambition. Every woman carried a story, a culture, and a god from her homeland. What began as political alliances slowly sowed seeds of desire within Solomon's heart. The man who prayed for wisdom now found himself pulled by passions as vast as his kingdom. The harem became a world within a world, with perfumes of Arabia, songs of Egypt, and dances of Sidon. It was a paradise of delights, yet beneath the splendor, currents of rivalry and longing stirred. Even as the temple stood in holy majesty, another temple was being built in Solomon's heart. It was a shrine to beauty, power, and the intoxicating sweetness of love from 1,000 lips. Solomon walked through gardens lined with lily, his steps shadowed by attendants, his heart entangled by the faces of many. Each smile reminded him of peace secured, but also of loyalties divided. Yet the world only saw the golden king, radiant in robes of glory. To his people, he was a symbol of strength, prosperity, and divine favor. Every throne in the ancient world looked toward Jerusalem with envy. The king who held the wisdom of God now commanded the desires of men and women alike. But the same wisdom that once judged disputes began to bend under the weight of his affections. The path toward 1,000 wives was not sudden. It was paved with small concessions, one alliance at a time. At banquets, he was surrounded by faces from every nation, their laughter echoing like music through the halls. The glitter of gold cups and the sway of dancers painted nights of endless pleasure. Servants whispered of the king's restless heart, a heart never satisfied with one love. Desire became hunger, and hunger became habit. Solomon, who once stood in purity before the altar of God, now found his heart divided between heaven and earth. The temple he built for the Lord remained, but his soul was building shrines of its own. Nations still marveled at his wisdom, but within his palace the struggle deepened. The women, each vying for affection, became symbols of Solomon's own divided devotion. Still, the world bowed before him, sending gifts and seeking counsel. No one saw the cracks forming in the foundation of the man who seemed untouchable. He was both the golden king and the captive of his own desires. His dream of wisdom and glory was now mingled with a burden he never sought. In the quiet of his chamber, he sometimes remembered that night at Gibeon when he asked only for wisdom. The innocence of that prayer contrasted with the complexity of his present life. The Golden King's story had begun with promise and purity, yet the seeds of longing had already taken root. What was once a dream from God was slowly becoming a test of the heart. And though the world celebrated his splendor, heaven watched with sorrow as the man of wisdom began walking a path that would one day unravel his glory. Would his wisdom be enough to save him from himself, or would the dream of Solomon's golden reign become a warning for generations to come? That question lingered like a shadow, even in the brightness of his throne. Trumpets echoed through Jerusalem as foreign envoys approached, their caravans stretching across the horizon with treasures meant for the Golden King. Each delegation carried not just wealth, but a daughter, a princess, a bride who would become part of Solomon's vast web of alliances. Marriage for Solomon was no longer merely about affection. It was a chessboard where kingdoms were the pieces. Every new bride meant a new treaty, every wedding a shield of peace against war. From Egypt to Moab, from Sidon to Sheba, royal families sent their daughters into his palace gates. Some came with pride, others with trembling fear, yet all knew they were stepping into the orbit of the world's most powerful king. The processions were dazzling spectacles, parades of beauty clothed in silk and adorned with jewels. Citizens watched in awe as camels laden with spices and gold filled the streets, signaling another union forged by their king. Within the palace walls, the harem expanded into a world of its own, a kingdom within the kingdom. It was a place where languages mingled, cultures collided, and the air was thick with both fragrance and rivalry. Every bride entered with dreams of winning the king's gaze, of becoming more than a treaty written in flesh. Yet for many, the dream quickly soured into a life of waiting behind golden doors. Some were daughters of mighty rulers, bold and confident in their status. Others were girls barely grown, exchanged like gifts, their hearts breaking in silence as they left homelands forever. Solomon moved among them with charm that made hearts flutter and loyalties bind. His wisdom gave him words that soothed fears and flattered egos, yet even he could not give equal attention to 1,000. In chambers lined with cedar and ivory, women rehearsed songs and dances to draw his notice. Perfumes from Arabia drifted through the halls, masking the scent of quiet despair. The nights of the palace were filled with music and laughter, yet also with whispers of jealousy. For every wife who caught his eye, there were dozens left forgotten in the shadows. Some women turned to rivalry, sharpening beauty with cunning and words with poison. Others withdrew, their days filled with longing glances at doors that might never open again. Children were born, heirs who carried the blood of many nations, further entangling the politics of the palace. Each mother dreamed her son might rise above the others, securing both her place and her people's. The harem became a storm of ambition, a place where every smile hid calculation. Behind jeweled veils and painted eyes, battles raged in silence, unseen by the crowds who cheered their king outside. Solomon sat at the center of this intricate web, balancing not only love but the fragile threads of diplomacy. A wrong word, a neglected wife, could ripple outward into distant kingdoms. Yet he carried himself with confidence, knowing that each bride was more than a woman. She was a nation's promise of peace. His palace became a theater of power where affection and politics were indistinguishable. But peace bought with passion came at a price. The heart that once sought only God's wisdom now juggled the desires of nations wrapped in silken garments. The harem's opulence was unmatched, filled with gold vessels, embroidered tapestries, and endless feasts. Yet beneath the splendor, the walls held sighs of loneliness and hearts craving genuine love. At banquets, wives adorned with crowns sat in dazzling rows, their jewels reflecting candlelight like stars in the night. Music played, but behind the smiles lay silent competition for the king's favor. Some women whispered prayers to their gods, pleading for Solomon's devotion to turn toward them. Their gods' names echoed softly in chambers that once were meant to honor only the Lord. The king's wisdom allowed him to listen, to nod, to promise, yet he could not erase the ache of neglect. Even Solomon, with all his insight, could not divide his heart 1,000 ways. Each marriage kept armies at bay, ensuring peace across borders. Yet each vow added another weight to the soul of the man who bore them. In the markets, people marveled at the prosperity these unions brought. Gold flowed in, caravans arrived daily, and the city thrived under the banner of peace. But inside the palace, where marble floors gleamed, the true cost was measured in tears that never reached the king's ears. Women who once sparkled with hope learned to live with absence. They decorated their chambers with memories of homelands, hanging fabrics from Phoenicia or burning incense from Egypt. Yet no memory could soften the sting of being one among hundreds. Solomon's presence was like the sun, warm and life-giving, but distant, shining on all yet belonging to none. His wives basked in his light when it touched them, but many were left in shadows. The world praised his brilliance, kings marveled at his strategy, but few saw the quiet wars fought behind his palace doors. For every treaty sealed, a heart was quietly surrendered. The harem was a living mosaic of cultures, dazzling and fractured. Unity in public masked the fractures of private longing. Some wives formed alliances among themselves, creating circles of support. Others turned against each other, seeing rivals instead of sisters. Solomon walked among them, carrying the burden of keeping peace within walls, even as he kept peace outside. His wisdom was stretched thin, trying to satisfy nations and soothe hearts. In time, the palace became a kingdom not of love, but of obligation. The man who ruled the world was slowly becoming ruled by the very alliances he had crafted. Thus, the story of 1,000 brides was both a triumph and a tragedy. It was the tale of a king who gained the world's peace but risked the peace of his own soul. The sun rose over Jerusalem, bathing the golden temple in light, as news spread of an approaching caravan from the distant south. The Queen of Sheba was coming, bringing treasures and questions meant to test the wisdom of Solomon. She was no ordinary ruler, but a woman of wealth, intellect, and commanding presence. Her kingdom stretched across trade routes rich in spices, gold, and incense, making her both powerful and mysterious. The streets of Jerusalem filled with onlookers as the caravan entered, camels adorned with jewels and carrying chests overflowing with riches. Perfumes scented the air, and musicians announced the queen's arrival with songs of awe. Solomon awaited her in the splendor of his court, clothed in robes that shimmered with threads of gold. His throne, carved from ivory and overlaid with pure gold, towered above all, guarded by lions at its steps. The queen entered with a presence that silenced the hall, her eyes sharp yet curious. She had not traveled miles to be charmed. She came to see if this man's wisdom was truly divine. Her voice carried confidence as she presented riddles, questions woven with depth and subtle traps. Each word was a test, meant to pierce through flattery and reveal the truth. Solomon answered with calm assurance, his responses layered with insight that left no doubt of his gift. The court watched in awe as the queen's puzzles unraveled before his wisdom. But this was more than a contest of intellect. It was a meeting of equals. In her gaze was admiration, and in his smile, a recognition of a spirit as formidable as his own. Their conversations stretched for hours, moving from politics to faith, from trade to the mysteries of life. Every exchange was a dance, each word carrying weight, each glance sparking silent curiosity. In the harem, whispers stirred like restless winds as news spread of the foreign queen. Solomon's wives, already rivals among themselves, now felt the sting of a woman whose beauty and power rivaled their own. Some whispered envy, fearing the queen would capture the king's heart. Others scoffed, dismissing her as another temporary fascination. Yet the queen's presence was undeniable, her aura filling every hall she entered. Servants marveled, musicians sang her praise, and merchants saw in her an ally worth pursuing. Solomon himself felt the tension between admiration and temptation. Was she merely a guest to be honored, or something more, a mirror of desires long hidden in his heart? Her questions about his God pierced deeper than the riddles she brought. She listened intently as Solomon spoke of the Lord who gave him wisdom, the God whose name was above all others. The queen's face softened as she heard of a faith unlike the rituals of her homeland. Something stirred within her, a respect not only for the man but for the God who empowered him. Still, the line between admiration and attraction blurred with every exchange. Courtiers noticed the way Solomon leaned closer, the way her laughter lingered in the air like music. Nights in the palace were filled with feasts in her honor, tables heavy with food and wine flowing like rivers. Solomon showcased his riches, his buildings, his choirs, his chariots, all to prove his glory was real. The queen's eyes widened at the sight of the temple, its gold gleaming in the sunlight, its courts alive with worship. She confessed that even rumors had not prepared her for the greatness she witnessed. In private, she spoke to her attendants of the weight of this man's presence. "Truly, his God has made him great," she whispered, acknowledging a glory beyond human strength. But in the harem, discontent brewed hotter each day. Women who once competed against each other now found a common rival in the radiant Queen of Sheba. They spoke of betrayal, of a king distracted, of love stolen by a foreign presence. Their jealousy was not unfounded, for the queen carried herself with a confidence unlike any other. Solomon tried to balance the storm, offering time and gifts to soothe his wives. Yet the queen's visit overshadowed every effort, her charm casting a shadow too large to ignore. The kingdom, however, saw only triumph. To the people, Solomon's court had conquered even the mysteries of the south, proving his wisdom was unmatched. Merchants dreamed of trade routes opening, priests rejoiced in the queen's acknowledgement of Israel's God, and the people celebrated their king's growing fame. The queen's departure was as grand as her arrival, her words leaving a mark on history. She declared Solomon's wisdom and wealth greater than legend, blessing his God before returning to her land. Yet the question lingered, was she more than a guest, more than a test? Some believed her heart had been touched. Others whispered she left carrying more than memories. For Solomon, her visit was both triumph and temptation. He had reached the peak of glory, admired by kings and adored by queens. Yet shadows began to creep into his reign. The harem's rivalries deepened, jealousy hardening into bitterness. Some wives began pressing harder for the worship of their gods, hoping to regain influence. The wisdom of Solomon was now tested not by riddles, but by affections, loyalties, and the pull of 1,000 voices. He was at his height, yet every height carries the risk of a fall. The visit of Sheba marked the pinnacle of Solomon's fame, but also hinted at his coming struggles. For in the applause of nations, the whisper of compromise had already begun. Thus the queen departed, her story woven into Solomon's legacy forever. And though the world saw only glory, heaven saw the shadows that would soon darken the golden king's reign. The palace of Solomon glittered like no other place on earth, yet behind its gilded walls lay stories of longing, rivalry, and heartbreak. The women within were both honored and imprisoned, living in a world where beauty was both their weapon and their curse. Every corridor of the harem echoed with footsteps of wives and concubines adorned in silk. Their laughter was rehearsed, their smiles sharpened, each hoping to catch the king's fleeting attention. For the fortunate few who captured Solomon's gaze, life was filled with gifts, jewels, and whispered promises. But for the many others, the days stretched into years of silence and neglect. Some women remembered the day of their arrival, the songs, the incense, and the cheers as they entered the palace. Yet those memories soon turned bitter as they realized the king's eyes might never rest on them again. The harem became an invisible battlefield where rivalry simmered behind polite greetings. Every woman fought for significance, for the smallest gesture of favor that could change her destiny. Children became pawns in this silent war, their mothers dreaming of heirs who might ascend to greatness. A son's smile could mean a mother's survival, while childlessness cast shadows of despair. Some wives whispered prayers to their foreign gods, hoping divine power would tilt Solomon's heart. Others turned their prayers to Israel's God. begging for mercy in their loneliness. Favoritism cut deep, leaving scars that no gold could heal. When the king's love tilted toward one, dozens of others sank into the shadows of forgotten chambers. Jealousy filled the air like smoke, poisoning friendships that might have offered comfort. Women watched each other with suspicion, seeing rivals instead of companions. In private, they wept into embroidered pillows, mourning the intimacy they craved but seldom received. The quiet sobs of neglected brides were muffled by walls that shone with wealth. Some masked their pain with laughter and song, dazzling the palace with performances meant to charm. Yet behind the painted eyes was an ache that no melody could erase. Servants moved carefully among them, carrying stories from one chamber to another. Every rumor became fuel for the fire of rivalry, deepening the unspoken wars. Those favored by Solomon walked with pride, their gowns brighter, their chambers richer. The others glanced at them with envy, wondering what made them worthy of the king's heart. Some brides grew old waiting, their beauty fading before they ever shared a night with the king. Their youth was sacrificed to a dream that never became reality. The palace became a place where women lived half-lives, adorned like queens but feeling like prisoners. Gold could not replace love, and silks could not soothe the ache of being unseen. There were nights when Solomon's presence filled the halls with joy, his laughter echoing like music. Yet for most, those nights were dreams they would never touch. A glance from him could ignite hope, while his silence crushed it just as quickly. Every step of his sandal across marble floors sent hearts racing, wondering whose door he would open. Mothers held their children close, whispering promises of greatness into their ears. The harem's rivalries passed from women to sons, fueling ambitions that would one day shape the kingdom's future. For every smile Solomon gave, a dozen tears fell unseen. His love, vast in number, was stretched too thin to heal the loneliness of so many. The women carried their longing like invisible chains, heavy yet hidden behind painted lips. They lived in a palace of abundance but starved for intimacy. Every festival and banquet became a stage for their silent competition. Dresses glittered, jewels sparkled, but the true battle was for a single glance of recognition. The burden of favoritism shaped the rhythm of palace life. When Solomon lingered with one, the others sank deeper into despair, their worth measured by moments they might never receive. Some turned bitterness into schemes, weaving alliances to undermine rivals. Others surrendered to resignation, living quietly in forgotten corners of luxury. The palace, though filled with music and feasts, often pulsed with tension. Behind the beauty of its walls lay a storm of unfulfilled desires. Loneliness was the most faithful companion of many women. They shared a house with hundreds, yet often felt more isolated than if they had been alone. Every woman remembered the hope with which she first entered Jerusalem. Yet over time, that hope faded into the shadows of chambers never visited. Some found solace in their children, pouring into them the love they longed to give their king. Others clung to memories of home, whispering songs from their homelands in the dark. Even in neglect, some hearts refused to stop yearning. The dream of being chosen, of being loved, still flickered like a fragile flame. The harem was a kingdom of competition, yet also a graveyard of forgotten dreams. Love was promised but rarely delivered, leaving scars that no crown could hide. And at the center of it all was Solomon, the man whose heart was too divided to belong to one. His palace shone with glory, but within its walls, love was often nothing more than an illusion. Thus the silent wars raged on, unseen by the world that praised his reign. For behind the glory of Solomon's throne, the women who bore his name lived lives of longing, jealousy, and quiet despair. The palace of Solomon, once filled with the fragrance of cedar and the songs of worship, slowly began to change its scent and sound. Foreign voices whispered in its halls, bringing with them gods that had no place in Jerusalem. Every new marriage carried not just a bride, but also a culture, a memory, and a faith tied to distant lands. These wives, far from home, longed to honor the deities of their fathers. They pleaded with Solomon to build shrines so they could worship as they once had. At first, their requests seemed harmless, tokens of affection to comfort homesick hearts. But each concession marked the beginning of a slow compromise. The king who built a house for the living God began laying stones for gods of clay and fire. In the hills outside Jerusalem, altars rose to Molech, Chemosh, and Ashtoreth. What began as a favor to wives became monuments to idols. The people watched in confusion as smoke from strange sacrifices mingled with the incense of the temple. The city that once pulsed with holiness began to breathe a divided air. The silence of heaven grew heavy, a quiet disapproval hanging over the golden throne. The Lord, who once filled the temple with fire, now withheld his voice from the king he had blessed. Solomon walked through courts that glittered with wealth, but felt the emptiness creeping into his soul. The wisdom that once guided nations began unraveling under the weight of divided loyalties. His wives bowed to gods of the sun and moon, while the king who prayed for wisdom turned his gaze away. Their songs filled the night, drowning the memory of songs once sung to the Lord. In his weakness, Solomon justified his choices as acts of peace. To him, building altars was a way to keep harmony in the palace, but in truth, it was the erosion of his devotion. The temple of God still stood, magnificent and holy, but it no longer held the king's undivided heart. The man who once lifted prayers with passion now drifted into rituals without fire. Foreign priests walked the streets of Jerusalem, their strange garments shocking the faithful. Their chants echoed in the valleys, mocking the covenant once sworn by Israel. The wives of Solomon danced before idols, their joy loud enough to stir jealousy among the neglected. Each shrine became a reminder that the king's heart was no longer one with his God. He who once judged righteously now grew clouded in discernment. Decisions once guided by heaven now faltered under the pressure of human desire. The people, though prosperous, sensed the shifting winds. Peace filled the land, but righteousness grew thin, like a flame smothered under smoke. Prophets looked on with sorrow, unable to silence the rising tide of idolatry. The covenant that bound Israel to God was being compromised by the very man chosen to protect it. Solomon's own prayers began to lose their weight. Words once soaked with faith now sounded hollow against the silence of heaven. The Lord, patient yet grieved, allowed the king to walk deeper into his folly. Wisdom without obedience had become a stumbling block instead of a blessing. The golden king had become entangled in the desires of others, unable to say no to the women he loved. His strength had been traded for approval, his devotion for diplomacy. On hills meant for vineyards and gardens, altars of fire blazed for gods who demanded blood. The land that had been promised to Abraham now echoed with chants to false deities. The Lord's anger rose, not in sudden fury, but in sorrowful silence. The God who had given Solomon wisdom and peace now prepared to strip away what he once blessed. The unraveling was subtle yet certain, like threads pulled from a royal garment. Each idol erected was another stitch of loyalty torn from the heart of the king. In the harem, wives smiled as their gods were honored with temples. They saw victory in stone and wood, unaware of the storm they had unleashed. Solomon's counselors whispered warnings, reminding him of the covenant. But his heart, soft toward his wives, had hardened against the voice of truth. Nights once spent in communion with God were replaced with feasts before idols. The songs of David gave way to the drums of foreign lands. The king who had stood in glory at the temple's dedication now stood among altars that grieved heaven. His hands, once raised to bless, now waved intolerance to false worship. He who was called the wisest of men had become blind to the danger at his gates. Knowledge had not kept him from folly, for his heart had strayed. The silence of God was louder than thunder, a judgment that lingered in every quiet moment. Solomon, surrounded by wives and wealth, no longer felt the nearness of the one who gave it all. The suspense hung heavy over Jerusalem. How long would God endure this betrayal? The King of Peace had invited war into his soul, and the seeds of division were already sown. Thus the glory of Solomon began to fade, not with the strike of a sword, but with the whisper of compromise. The man who once asked for wisdom had become a warning for all who loved too many gods. His choices marked the beginning of a fracture that would outlive him. For the king who bowed to idols left behind a kingdom destined to break. The whispers of prophecy hung like thunderclouds over Jerusalem, even while the city glowed with gold and music. Behind the curtains of triumph, a darker truth was already being written in the scrolls of heaven. The Lord had spoken. Because Solomon's heart had turned away, the kingdom would fracture after his death. The crown that had shone with unmatched brilliance would soon split like a jar of clay dropped upon stone. Within the palace walls, Solomon's 1,000 wives had become both jewels and chains. What began as alliances and indulgence ended as snares binding the heart of Israel's king. In the streets, traders from distant lands still marveled at the splendor of the temple and the endless feasts of the court. Yet heaven's silence pressed heavier than the applause of nations. Solomon, who once prayed with trembling lips for wisdom, now prayed less and less. The fire that once burned on the altar of his heart flickered beneath the smoke of compromise. Foreign altars dotted the hills of Jerusalem, their incense rising where only one name was meant to be exalted. The king who once sang songs of devotion now funded shrines that mocked the covenant of his fathers. His wives, each pleading for their gods, filled the palace with petitions. What seemed like harmless appeasement soon became the slow bleeding of loyalty to the Holy One. The women who had been brought as tokens of peace became instruments of unrest. Peace treaties turned into spiritual wars, fought not with swords, but with divided affections. The man who once judged between two mothers with piercing wisdom could not judge between truth and error in his own chambers. His silence became permission, and permission became participation. The sorrow of heaven was mirrored in the sorrow of forgotten wives, who realized the king who sought many loves had lost the truest one. Even the songs of the Levites could not drown out the sound of idols rising from foreign tongues. The prophet's words reached Solomon like the echo of his father Nathan's rebuke. Because you have turned your heart, The kingdom will be torn from your son." Each syllable struck harder than the clang of a sword. The son of David, once the builder of God's temple, had become a builder of stumbling blocks. The kingdom he raised with wisdom would be divided because of folly. The irony was cruel. The man who possessed everything, wealth, power, wisdom, and love, lost the one thing he was commanded to guard: faithfulness to his God. The golden king who dazzled the world now walked with shadows in his halls. The laughter of his wives became reminders of the walls he had erected against heaven. As Solomon aged, the palace grew louder with rivalries and ambitions. Each wife dreamed of her child inheriting the throne, but the prophecy had already spoken of division. Rehoboam, his son, watched his father's contradictions with troubled eyes. He saw a man of unmatched glory and yet of aching weakness, a father admired and mourned in the same breath. The city that once gathered to worship at one temple now saw sacrifices scattered on every hill. The heart of Israel began to fracture long before its borders did. Solomon's throne of ivory and gold still gleamed, but the weight of guilt bent his shoulders lower each day. The wisdom that once guided nations now tormented him with the knowledge of his failure. Night after night he wandered the echoing courts of the temple he built. The holy place remained unchanged, but the builder felt unworthy to stand within it. The man who had once written songs of love now penned words of vanity. "All is meaningless," his soul groaned, haunted by the emptiness of his indulgences. Wives who had once entered the palace with hope now carried bitterness. Their children played in rival groups, knowing they would soon be pitted against one another. The kingdom's peace was already cracking beneath the surface. The silence of heaven was no longer silence, but judgment waiting for its appointed hour. Solomon wept in secret, unseen by the women who filled his courts. He knew the truth that his 1,000 brides had cost him the gaze of the one who mattered most. The eternal irony was carved into the story. The wisest man became the cautionary tale of folly. Greatness was undone not by enemies but by the desires of his own heart. The temple that had once symbolized Israel's unity would stand as witness to the nation's division. The stones would testify that obedience, not gold, was the true foundation of glory. His legacy was no longer pure light, but shadow and light entwined. The songs of joy mingled with the dirges of regret, a kingdom both blessed and broken. As Solomon looked upon his wives, he no longer saw triumph, but the face of his undoing. Each smile reminded him of a compromise, each embrace of a commandment forsaken. He could not reverse the prophecy, though he longed to undo his choices. The weight of eternity pressed upon him, heavier than any crown. Jerusalem, once exalted, now trembled with the footsteps of judgment. The holy city would outlast Solomon, but not without bearing the scars of his divided heart. History etched his fall with ruthless clarity. From glory to ashes, his story became a mirror for every soul tempted by desire more than devotion. The suspense of his life remains in the question left unanswered. Was Solomon's downfall a warning to others, or a reflection of the same weakness within us all? The scroll of his reign closed not with triumph, but with tension. His 1,000 wives had written a legacy both magnificent and tragic, echoing across generations as both marvel and warning. The wisest king became the saddest lesson, and through him heaven still whispers, "What will you trade for the love of the one who gives all things?" If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. That's the only way you can help us. Keep telling the truth that saves.